I don't know what's wrong with Tanzania. Say you can be wrong.
But I think it's great.
I had lunch for 10 years, so they didn't have lunch.
And then I had relatives.
I'll tell you what I think's gonna like me. Is there is working rates so hard. Yes.
You're live, Larry. You're live now.
Well, thank you. Okay, I'm alive.
Ah.
Yay! Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your courage in showing up today. And for those of you on our stream, hello. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. And I appreciate your courage in showing up because this is going to be hard and difficult and painful. How's that for a
And that case, I'm leaving.
Okay, we can leave now.
You can, but here's the backdrop to what we're gonna do over the next 4 weeks. October 7th brought to mind that which should have been in our minds on a very strong and powerful level. Not only is the rise of anti-Semitism something that in some cases we've been naive about over the past decades, thinking that it has absolved and resolved itself in the culture. But in addition, our awarenesses about Israel and the basis of Israel and the controversies about Israel are, in many cases, with lots of gaps. So it is my goal over these next 4 sessions for us to be doing a very deep dive into the issues of anti-Judaism, which morphs into anti-Semitism, and move on to a very in-depth look at Israel and the existential realities of the Middle East and how they are presented as a result of October 7th. Okay, anybody have a question to begin at all? As I said to another rabbi yesterday, October 7th is a time of enormous upset within the Jewish world, as well as hopefully the rest of the world. And it has created among Jews real fissures and demarcation lines. It's an opportunity on one end for Jews to learn what they never really understood about the existence of the State of Israel, the creation of the State of Israel, the history of the State of Israel, and the current geopolitical realities of the Middle East, which is something that I intend to address. Already you want to talk? Pleasure.
Well, I think one of the other things that we've, I don't know, ignored, but it's been a issue that we weren't addressing, and I think this is worldwide, is the growth of the Muslim communities all over the world
Okay.
are having an effect.
I hear you. I think we have more trouble right now with white Christian supremacists here in the United States and their behaviors and perceptions of others, and we are the other. So, how many of you are familiar with this verse from the book of Exodus? Which in essence captures down, can you read it? Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. The ultimate question here is whose ox is gored? And I want you to think about that as a kind of operative paradigm for how all phenomena within the world are both understood, processed, and engaged. Because all of us respond from our own little bubbles. Things that don't worry anybody else, they don't care. Because it's our ox that's been gored, or it's their ox that's been gored. And most people today, especially in the culture we live in, are really only involved with their own subset. And I believe it's gotten much worse during the course of our lifetimes. In 1972, a professor at Harvard named Philip Slater, who I had the opportunity to study with, wrote a book called The Pursuit of Loneliness. And in this book, he was prophetic and prescient in describing how American culture had moved into almost total isolation. People didn't know who lived on their block. People didn't care about anybody else who lived on their block. They cared only really about their own little environment. There used to be what's known as the social compact in American, at least political science terminology, that talked about our kind of global engagement as a society, our values that we shared, and we were supportive of them. When you think about the core of Jewish learning and Jewish experience, we speak of ourselves as a covenant people. Remember the word brit? You know, it's not just with the moil on the 8th day. It's a concept that we are all supposed to be engaged with. And the rabbis teach us that the concept of the brit, the covenant, is twofold. It's both personal, but it's also communal. So you remember those lines from Hillel, if I'm not for myself, you remember the statement? That is at the essence of the idea that we are not only committed to our own self-perception, but we have a relationship and engagement with a larger group. So you want to
Can
say?
you repeat that saying? I heard it, but I don't remember the whole thing. I'm not for myself.
Now, yeah, who, what am I, and if not now, when?
It's not-
Only for myself, what am I?
Yes. So think about how culture that you live in has changed so dramatically that the only thing that seems to matter is us individually. You remember 40 years ago, there was a cover of Time magazine reflecting the idea that it was the me generation. Everybody had splintered off into themselves. Well, from my perspective, it was a very effective way of breaking down the way in which we used to react in society to things that were concerning or upsetting. Without that kind of global interaction or communal perception, people are isolated on their own little mountains. And the issue of whose ox is gored becomes very narrow. I remember when I was in Rochester as the rabbi for Kodesh, we had a rabbi and a priest group that met every month to study together. And on one of those events, there had been a terrorist attack on a Catholic church in Islamabad in Pakistan. And I went into this meeting quite distressed, and I said to the priests who were there, God, you guys must be so upset. They just had this shooting, this terrorist act in the church. They said, oh, that's politics. Now, I want you to remember certain events like the bombing of the JCC in Buenos Aires in South America, not that many years ago. There were missions from the United States, from the world, the Jewish community, that responded to that event because of the idea of communal engagement and responsibility. The idea that everybody's on their own really reflects some of the reactions to what's been going on here in our country since October 7th. As a force we all used to live in a world where there were many, many voices that spoke out on social, political, economic, educational issues. We may not have agreed with many of them, but there used to be organizations like the National Council of Churches, the American Conference of Catholic Bishops, the President's Council of Jewish Organizations. The list is enormous. Do you hear those voices anymore? I don't. The only voices that we hear tragically are either on the right or the left, and they're political. There are no countervailing voices in the midst of the society. I used to be on the interface on behalf of the Jewish world with the Conference of Bishops. And they used to make statements all the time about lots of issues, many of which I didn't agree with, but at least they had a voice that was in the community. There used to be the head of the UAHC, before it became the URJ, a rabbi named Alexander Schindler, who was out there. You might not have agreed with him, but he was out there. I'll ask you this silly question. Do any of you even know who the president of the Union for Reform Judaism is? You know. 1 out of 10, a million, right? Or more that were here. Rick Jacobs is the president. Where is he? He's absent from the dialogue, but he's not alone. This is something that I believe we need to recreate in the culture and the society that we live in, or we are really off on our own little ice floats. So, whose ox is gored is something that I want you to think about as we proceed into the depth of a lot of these dilemmas and arguments as to, well, does anybody else care? I ask you, how many of you heard from Christian friends after October 7th? Many of you know I'm a professor at the Catholic Seminary here in Florida. And the seminary is for all of Florida, Raleigh, Savannah, Atlanta, and it also has students from other places around the world. I heard from a lot of my students, which I was very thankful for, that they emailed me and told me that they were very upset and concerned. But I want you to think about the relationships that we need to have where people actually understand us as we understand them and react to the dilemmas that we're in. A safety report, look at that. What is that about? How do we get rid of this? Oh, no,
On the computer, press OK.
it's not on my computer.
Larry, it's on the TV. I'll come take care of it.
Okay,
Can I ask a question?
of course, no, you can't, I'm sorry, you're only allowed one.
I think you're talking, among other things, about complacency,
Okay.
among other things. And, I'm a former teacher, and I've been noticing it for the last 20, 30 years.
Right.
This feeling of complacency.
Yep.
Whereas we go back, think about the soldiers coming back from World War II, how active people were about issues and supporting other people.
Right.
And I'm just baffled by this.
The society and the culture has changed, which is disturbing, but it's something that we need to be aware of and not avoiding. As soon as you get to this, because I don't even know.
But it seems to me that we become so insulated and independent
Yes,
versus people had to join together and
Right.
be more
I
on
agree.
the outside of their homes than on the inside of their homes.
I totally agree with you, and that's capsulizing exactly what I was trying to share with you as we kind of parse these dilemmas and challenges. So I want you to look at Martin Luther and what he said. Most human affairs come down to depending upon whose ox is gored. And I totally agree with Martin Luther, though I don't agree with much of what he said or did. Okay, let's go on. Okay. We're going to take a look at some of the outrageous impacts of October 7th that have taken place. October 7th, Canadian police investigating a firebomb in a synagogue in Montreal. There have been 324 reported hate incidents against Muslims and Jews in the Montreal area since October 7th, in the first month. U.S. anti-Semitism, according to ADL, is up 337%. And this was not last week. These statistics were coming out a month or so ago. Look at the rise of incidents regarding Hamas. Australia, 591%, 1,563 anti-Semitic incidents across the UK. Okay, now think about the UK today. Only 8% of the UK population identifies as being religious, Christian. Okay, the Queen and the King might think so, but it's not. Okay, have any of you ever read the book, which I recommend to you, written by Isabel Wilkerson, called Caste? Any of you familiar with the book? It's a very important book. Honestly, it gets a little redundant if you sit to read it, but you can find online articles from the New Yorker and other sites that capsule what it is that she is presenting, and again, how right on she is about reality. Can you read this or not?
Yes.
It's readable. So I think that first paragraph, in many ways, is describing some of what is going on in this country that we care about.
Larry, can
Yes,
I read it because there are people who can't read it?
please, go ahead and read.
For as long as there has been a United States of America, people of European descent, people who look like the early colonists, have been the majority and the dominating caste. What happens at merely the thought of a reconfiguration, the looming prospect of a 2042 or 2045, the years the census has alternately projected as the point of a demographic sea change? Should I go on?
Please.
2021 U.S. Census Bureau made a startling announcement. For the first time in American history, the white population showed a numerical decline, the only racial or ethnic group to do so, falling by 8.6% from 223.6 million in 2010 to 204.3 million in 2020, as the white birth rate lagged that of the Black and Latino population, and as white deaths exceeded white births.
I want you to think about the power of this statement in regard to what you have been observing over the past 10 years. In the way in which this country has attempted, in some political senses, to disenfranchise voters who are not white, as a way to try and stop this. But there are even more offensive realities if you follow her theory. You see the word in the beginning of the second sentence?
Explain it.
Are you familiar with the concept of replacement theory?
In Charlottesville, it was the great replacement.
That's correct. Charlottesville highlights Jews will not replace us. This wacky conspiracy perception that somehow minorities are in favor of mass immigration to the United States as a way to disenfranchise those who have owned this country since its very beginning. White Christian people.
Something my daughter told me this morning, which is just this. There's a local election in Westborough, Massachusetts today. And to get something on the ballot, all you need are 10 people to put something on the ballot. Westborough, Massachusetts was a Christian community. Lots of Jews, lots of Muslims now have moved in. On the ballot, there is an amendment to have any child born in Westborough come back and an original, like if you grew up in Westborough years ago, come back and have children, you get $1,000 per child. So all of the other, well, daughter's friends had to go out and vote against this, because because they're afraid of all the minorities moving in and voting, that they're losing their white Christian majority, and it was like perfect for this.
I think it's scary to consider it, but we can see various places where this is infiltrating culture, behavior, and choices made by legislatures. And it's impacting what happened since October 7th. It's part of this whole gestalt of changing culture and changing environments that we need to be aware of. I'm not asking you to be scared. I'm asking you to be proactive. I'm asking you to tell your friends and to kind of pin the tail on the donkey about what is happening in this country under the guise of whatever they're hiding it under. She says on the bottom, the hierarchy of caste is not about feelings or morality, but about power. Which groups have it and which do not. And let it also be said, for those of you who may have studied sociology, for a long time, Jews thought they were kind of okay because they could pass as being white. They didn't stand out the way other ethnic minorities looked. And as a result of that, let's understand what took place in vast numbers as American Jews looked to be part of the greater culture. Changed their names, changed the way they looked. Remember all the jokes about nose jobs in Jews? We have to be aware of this in terms of how people morphed into the culture because they thought they were being accepted, and now all of a sudden we're standing outside. Okay, this is important for you to hear.
Can you read it?
We can read it. A caste system is an artificial fixed construction ranking of human value that sets the presumed supremacy of one group against the presumed inferiority of the other groups on the basis of ancestry and often immutable traits. A caste system uses rigid, often arbitrary boundaries to keep the ranked group apart, discrete from one another, and in their assigned places. Throughout history, and this is where she identifies in her perception, three dominant caste systems have stood up. Nazi Germany, the Aryan model. Some of you have studied Holocaust information where they had created this mythology of the Aryan as being the super race, and they even had, in their own perception, had drawn drawings of different ethnicities and lowering them in the hierarchy. The caste system of India. Many of you are familiar with that either through literature or maybe travel or having seen. Now, one of my students is Indian, and we were talking about this in class, and yes, the Indian government has outlawed the caste system, but it still exists. They're known as Dalits now, not as untouchable, but they still exist in India. Where I'm asking you to take a broader view is understanding that there is an operative caste system here in the United States. The most obvious is the way in which African Americans, blacks have been treated and kept, but it's not just that, okay? Remember the movie that I saw well after it came out, Gentleman's Agreement? Okay? The kind of subtle anti-Semitic. How about Boca Raton?
Oh, Gentleman's Agreement, that's a movie that?
Yeah, it was built, it was in the 50s, I think.
It actually, just interject, sorry, I guess based on, an area in Connecticut called Darien,
Yes,
that they call Darien, and I will tell you, living close to, I live 5 minutes from Darien, there is still unbelievable anti-Semitism. I walked into a candy store about 5 years ago, and this gentleman had a menorah and a little tree. He was telling me a story that a woman came in, saw the menorah and said, "What's that for? There's no Jews here." And then there's this group of Reform Jews, that are gay, so they've got this whole, thing going on, and obviously discrimination on several fronts.
right,
And they actually, last year was the first year, they lit a menorah in Darien,
okay.
but it's still
But
very.
Darien's not alone,
Right,
okay?
I'm just saying.
Let's remember, Boca Raton was a restricted community when Bethel came to be,
Oh, yeah.
okay? And think about how that has transformed. We know areas on Long Island that were restricted. We know areas in Rochester, where I was for 18 years, where there were deeds that said you are not permitted to sell to blacks or Jews. And those aren't isolated realities.
But the Fair Housing Act in 1978 changed all that
Yes,
to an
okay.
extent.
It changed a lot, but it didn't change everything.
There is a way to, I think you're a realtor as well, there's a way that people sort.
Okay,
By the way, it exists in China as well.
okay. Yes,
Caste system exists.
with the various individuals and the various.
Yeah.
This is a chart of anti-Semitic incidents, hostile incidents in December of 2019. What I'm gonna show you is events that took place before there was ever an October 7th. There were vicious acts of anti-Semitism and destruction against Jews and Judaism. You remember this thing in Coleyville, Texas?
Oh, yeah.
Hostages
And they were-
before October 7th. So take a look at this political cartoon from 2012. Okay, it's a tax return at 1040. This guy has an umbrella and he's dealing with what's taxable, what isn't taxable. But the part that intrigues me
Yeah.
Nice.
is the individual.
Where was this cartoon?
It was in American newspapers. What does a guy look like to you?
Definitely. Supposed to be a
Horrific,
Jewish
horrific
guy.
Jewish person.
Right.
A what?
Character.
Caricature of a Jew.
Hmm.
So remember that line, whose ox is gored?
Yeah.
So what happens when you see something like this? And what happens when somebody else looks at it? So here's the story. When I was on Long Island, I was in a town called Glen Cove on the North Shore of Long Island. And we had congregants who lived in 29 different communities and came to us. Some of them lived in this very quaint little town adjacent to Glen Cove known as Seacliff. It's a mile-square town, it's adorable, it's on a cliff, it looks over Long Island Sound, it has a lot of old Victorian homes, and there were Jews who lived there. One day, parents went to drop off their children at the elementary school and were aghast to find out that the building had been defaced with spray paint. What were the signs on the building? Satanic stars, skaters rule, penises and vaginas, and a swastika. The reactions were exactly whose ox is gored. The majority population was so upset that the building had been defamed. The Jewish parents bringing their kids to elementary school saw the swastikas. Anti-Semitism. Other parents, ooh, I don't like people drawing penises and vaginas on buildings. All kinds of sexual behavior stuff. I was called in because of my training and abilities, perhaps, to process the two boys who were arrested for having done this, a 13-year-old and a 15-year-old. What was intriguing about that was, again, what did these symbols mean to them? And in reality, all they meant was a FU to everybody else. They had no awareness in any sense of what these things were. They just knew that they were power symbols. Now that's a simple one. But what's intriguing is how other people saw it. Because they saw it out of their own vulnerability and sensitivity, what they took away from that conglomeration of symbols. I showed this picture yesterday to 30 young men who were studying to be priests. They didn't see anything there. Well, when I finished, they finally got it. But in their view, they don't know that. They don't see that. We do. Okay? Years ago, I was working with a woman who chose to be Jewish, who had grown up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a very Catholic environment. And during winter break, she went home to be with her family as she was in process to being part of the Jewish community. She came back, came into my office, and she was really agitated. And I said, what's going on with you? What's up? It's disgusting, she said. What's up? It's everywhere, she said. I still don't know what you're talking about. It's in the bank, it's in the grocery store, it's in the supermarket, it's in the gas station. Okay, what's all that Christmas stuff? It's everywhere. And I said, congratulations, you have just gotten your first set of minority eyes. Because to everybody else, it's lovely, it's so nice, it's pleasant, it's a lovely time of year. Before a lot of what we're talking about became so pointed after October 7th, probably the most uncomfortable time of year for Jews and Jewish parents is Christmas. Because it's one point in time where Jews aren't viewed as being totally, or historically weren't viewed as being totally part of American culture. We were the outsiders. So what did a lot of Jewish families do? Oh, we have a Hanukkah bush. You know, it's so pretty. We like to have it. We don't want to disturb our kids from feeling part of everything that they could possibly choose. That's the way it used to be. New Orleans, which was and may continue to be the most highly assimilated city in the United States, had historically a very large and affluent Jewish community that for most of the year were integrated into the Catholic elite structure. But coincidentally, every time it was time for Mardi Gras and the groups to get together to build the floats or to start up for the parade, oh, those families were in Europe. You know why? Because they were horrified that they would be excluded. So rather than face the affront of not being included, which they wouldn't have been, they took off. Have you been to New Orleans and gone to the Mardi Gras parade? No. Not the parade, the museum. It is a fascinating museum because culturally, it's not just fun and games and let's go have a parade. It's based within Christianity. It's part of all of that religious behaviors, though it's become secularized as the world has continued. Keep this in your thoughts if you can.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Do you think that the young man that you showed that picture to
Yeah.
didn't get it? Because we're older and we understand about Nazism and all that type of thing. And they're too young to understand all that business with the noses and all that type of thing. And do you think that that's maybe why they wouldn't have?
No, I don't agree with you. And I'll tell you why. Because they just aren't attuned to it. That's not the way they see the world. And one of the things I said to this group yesterday was, my batteries are done, was I said to them, you guys are much too young to remember when being Catholic in the United States wasn't exactly a privileged position. That if you go back and you look at the reaction to John Kennedy running for president, the reactions were, he's gonna be on the phone with the Pope every day, the Pope's gonna decide. Sir, what do you want
I
to say?
grew up in Boston. Boston right now is probably 90% Irish. I
Yeah,
remember, wasn't that many years ago as a kid, there were signs that said no Irish accepted on jobs. It would say in the newspaper that they were looking for maids, but no Irish need apply. But look how that's turned around.
yes, you're right.
And I wanna go back to holidays. What
Yeah.
about Halloween? That's another, isn't it
Yes.
Christian oriented?
Originally, my clicker broke, so I have to, my batteries went out, so I gotta do this. Wait a second, let's go.
What kind of batteries you need, Larry?
They're double A's, triple A's. How many of you remember this picture?
Yeah,
How many of you remember looking at this picture?
yeah, I see it.
Okay. Can you describe what the context is?
Holocaust, they're persecuting the Jews and bringing them where, starting there.
Yes, that's the kind of umbrella of the picture, but the circumstances are Warsaw Ghetto, young man, little boy, had stolen some bread, starving. Stolen some bread, caught, and is surrendering. And I'm always struck by this guy with a gun. Because the observation is, he's about to kill the kid. So I've always been intrigued.
Does he actually kill the kid?
No. But here's what intrigues me. Who is this? We know who this kid is. Let's think about the soldier. He's not SS. He's probably just normal Wehrmacht army. Has a wife, children. They're all at home waiting for daddy to come home. He's probably very nice to his children. Probably cares about them. And my question is, how was he able to do that? Well, because let's remember what the Nazis accomplished in the way in which they had dehumanized Jews and Judaism.
Propaganda.
Jews were subhuman. So it didn't matter if you killed them. They were like the rats in the sewers. You were doing the country and the society a favor by doing this. You know, it's easy to merely focus on Hitler as the source of all of this. But if people didn't listen and didn't have it in their DNA and guts, nothing would happen. The same thing is true in American culture today. That a lot of what is being represented by certain people is resonating with others. You know the line, oh, I have a lot of Jewish friends, but I hate Jews. So part of what we are going to be investigating is, this didn't start from October 7th. This has been in the water, in the DNA for centuries, if not millennia. And it has warped through various permutations that we're going to look at. And it's important that we feel it and understand it. Okay. All right, just take a look at this.
Reaction.
This isn't real, okay? Let me just say that. You can get offended if you like, but it's a mock-up. What the purpose of the person who put this together was to show the enormous hypocrisy of society and culture regarding issues concerning Jews, which we see even today in the way in which the media represents what has happened since October 7th. There was a day, October 8th, what Hamas has done is horrific, it is horrible, they've raped, they've killed, they've polluted. Now it's, oh, that Israel, they don't know when to stop. Those poor Palestinians, and it's true. The people in Gaza are getting slammed. But that isn't the only message or the issue. I wrote an editorial for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, which in essence said, why is Israel the only country in the world, thank you very much, how many do you need? Just two. Is the only country in the world where they're not allowed to defend themselves, and by defending themselves, they're. I just want to make sure it works. Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. Yes, I think it is. Did it change? All right, you know, we're just right off. There you go, okay. So I want you to think about for just a minute the demographics. If there truly were, and I believe there were 1,400 individuals who were killed on October 7th by Hamas invaders, Israel is maybe a country of 10 million. We'll wrap it up to 10, maybe it's 9 point something. If we say there are 350 million people in the United States, that means the United States is 35 times larger than Israel. If you multiply 1,400 by 35, you get the demographic equivalent of people who would have been killed here in the United States through some kind of terrorist act. I ask you to consider if close to 50,000 Americans had been killed by a terrorist attack, don't you think the United States would respond? Perhaps they may have learned a lesson from Iraq and Afghanistan about how to do it a little bit more effectively or a little bit with greater planning, but nonetheless, they would have responded, yes.
A lot of what you're talking about is psychological.
Okay,
And in regard to that, since the Vietnam War, which was really the first war in which we saw live action on TV,
Yeah.
previous to that, the
right,
wars we had,
With
some
Disney.
movies or
right,
pictures, photographs. Since then, we have been subjected more and more and more, whether it's riots or other catastrophes.
right.
So I'm gonna use the word jaded. I
Okay.
think, and then even all the video games now, kids are
Yes,
into the
okay.
super violence. The movies have super violence, TV is expanded. I think we become jaded,
Okay, I don't disagree with you.
all of us, to the level of toleration and acceptance. And there's so many wars and atrocities going on
Yes, there
all the
are.
time.
But let me.
But
let me make my point.
psychologically,
Okay.
okay,
Let me make my point, because I think that what I'm trying to draw a comparison with has to do with the world and Western world's reaction to the Israeli response in Gaza. And that is, again, if there had been 50,000 Americans killed in one day with a terrorist attack, the American military would respond. But the point that I wanted to make beyond the fact that, yes, we have become very jaded to a lot of this, and a lot of it replicates what kids do on their video games. Would the United States be open to having a ceasefire?
I can't hear you, Bruce.
Would the United States be willing to have a ceasefire?
Who knows today, the way.
Well, what I'm saying to you is, Israel as a country is held to a very different standard than every other country in the world. Are they always right? Absolutely not. I am a firm supporter of the state of Israel. I was with the IDF in Shalom HaGalil, which was the invasion of Lebanon in 1982. It doesn't mean that Israel does everything wonderfully. And I don't like Netanyahu, we'll put that on the table, and I believe that Netanyahu currently is allowing this thing to exacerbate because he knows if it ends, he's out of office. This government is over. Nonetheless, independent of what we might feel about the way in which they are acting, Israel has every right to respond. My concern, and I will reiterate it over the month, is that the end result will not necessarily be the goal of the mission. You can't kill ideology. We talked about this on Saturday. Ideology, it's not a military force of a government and a country that can be subdued. It is an ideology that we are dealing with. And you saw where all of the money that was given for humanitarian needs in Gaza were used to build extensive underground tunnels that are really just a military base. Okay. Yes, sir.
They talk about the Palestinians having living side by side, having a Palestinian state side by side with an Israeli state, a Jewish state, but like their ideology is kill all Jews. From the river to the sea, how can you have that exist unless you change their ideology?
And I don't disagree with you. I used to be.
However, there is, I don't know, it's probably a minority, but there are a lot of Arabs and Jews that live side by side as Israelis and
Yes.
get along fine. Is it possible that if you to change that ideology to the point where maybe instead of there being two separate states, they can come together as a unity as one state?
Let me talk to you
Israel
about,
being
let me
both
talk to you about that because
Palestinian
that,
and Jewish as one.
here's the problem. Israel was founded as a Jewish state. It does not want to be a binational state.
Well, see, that's the problem.
Well, but it's reality in terms of the founders and the concepts. Israel, in its tiny little piece of real estate, was created as a way to react to the failure of emancipation in Europe in the 19th century. That's what motivated the early Zionists. And we'll talk about this during the month. The goal was not to be like every other nation, but to be a Jewish state. And it cannot be if it becomes overrun demographically by an Arab population. Let's also remember.
Off their own land, like enough, but the thousands have been living there for centuries and all of a sudden.
Well, so were
they
Jews.
come off and then settle.
So were Jews. So were Jews. Let's talk about the fact Saudi Arabia will not allow Palestinians into their country.
Egyptians don't.
Egypt,
Oh,
I was just gonna say that.
True.
Egypt will not allow them. In reality, none of them really give a damn about them as anything other than a political pawn, which has been in existence in 1948. In 1993 or 4, I went to Jordan prior to the peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. And I had a meeting with Crown Prince Hassan, who was projected to be the king after Hussein died. It never happened that way. But in that meeting with Crown Prince and his advisors, who are all Western educated, I said to him, would you ever consider or believe there could be a reconfederation of the West Bank with the East Bank? You understand the difference?
Yes.
Okay.
One is either, you know,
The
such
East
a-
Bank is Jordan. West Bank was the kidney that became part of Israel in administrative sense since 1967. And Crown Prince Hassan, without missing a beat, looked at me, there were 5 of us in the room, and said, who will be king? You have to think about that. Because what that taught me, and you put it into historical context, in the early 1980s, the PLO was attempting to dethrone Hussein. Hussein, with the power of his Bedouin guard, who were loyal and fierce, were able to throw out the PLO from Jordan. They went to the weakest nation in the Middle East and went to Lebanon and totally destabilized Lebanon. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is not particularly interested in having this other population destabilizing them even today. And it's part of the geopolitics of the Middle East that, unfortunately, they're the loners. Talk about a caste system in the Arab world, they're at the bottom of it. They'll use them, they'll exploit them, but they don't do anything for them. There are,
Palestinians that don't.
yes, whatever Palestinian means, okay? Let's realize that whether we like it or not, and again, they have not annexed the West Bank or the Golan. They are under military observation, whatever word you want to use. The lifestyle of the people who live there far improved both educationally, medically, and economically with Israel being there than it was when it was under Jordan. Doesn't mean everybody wants it like that, but it needs to be understood. And I'm not saying that Israel is blameless in what has taken place over the past, that's almost 60 years.
Creating more settlements and all that kind of stuff.
You know what? I don't mind them making settlements. I'm offended by some of the right-wing settlers and their behavior, their hostility, and in terms of their behavior towards their neighbors.
Right.
Okay, I don't support that, but the idea that the West Bank should be Judenrein, why? For a long time, when they talked about a two-state solution, when it seemed to be some level of negotiation going on, whether it was Camp David or the Oslo Accords or these other moments, there was awareness on both sides. And I met with Faisal Husseini. I was invited to meet with Arafat. I did not. I didn't want to be in the room with him. 90% of the Israeli settlements or villages, whatever you want to call them, are within 5 to 8 miles over the Green Line, which is the 67 border. So there was already talk that was.
When you say over the Green Line, meaning on what was, Arab land, Palestinian.
Let's just say West Bank, Judea, Samaria, whatever you like, okay? There were already conversations which said that there would be accommodations made to redraw that boundary to include those areas within whatever would have been the settlement of the two-state model. And we will look at this in terms of maps. Arafat walked away from the PLO gaining total control of 95% of the West Bank. He walked away. Okay, we'll get there. Hate crimes. I want want you to take a look at the historic evolution of hate crimes. 2008, 65% of them were committed against Jews, Muslims 7.7%. You can't really see this. This is motivation for hate crimes. Remember the Pittsburgh synagogue massacre? The California synagogue shooting in 2019. This was after October 7th. This was December 7th, a month after. Albany synagogue. 2017, we've moved from 2008 to 2017. 58% are anti-Jewish. 2017, it was kind of quiet. Nationwide. Look at the volume. Dominantly anti-Jewish. Doesn't excuse the anti-Muslim, but the Jewish ones are almost 4 times as many.
What success is the ADL having with this?
I don't really know.
Okay.
I think the ADL, I don't mind Jonathan, I don't mind him as a spokesperson, he's out there. And he's fairly articulate. But let me ask the question, does anybody in this group belong to ADL?
What is that synagogue? I heard of
The anti-defamation.
it.
Remember, there used to be the American Jewish Congress, the American Jewish Committee. You name it, they don't exist anymore. So yes, there is a president of ADL, and he gets on TV shows in the way in which, unfortunately, TV has become echo chambers that reflect the people, what station you're on. So I don't know if he's being effective at all, but I'm glad that he's at least out there talking about it.
Gotta have somebody.
Look at this, it's 1 o'clock already. Did I bore you to death? Yes.
Yeah, the whole.
Okay, we got a lot to go. We have a lot to go. Just look at this. These are from 2008 to 2017. It really hasn't been quiet over the decades. We'll pick up here next week. Is that okay?
Yes.
Thank you all very much.
Thank
Sure.
Are we finished, Larry?